对的比中指，
Alright.
差不多去考比中指。
Let's start it recording.
哦，这我刚刚
Okay, so my presentation is about the Red Scare, which is the same as what Vivian and Samantha have talked about. It's actually two distinct and different periods in time in American history, both with strong senses of anti-communism in the United States, which include obviously the first and second Red Scare. And the dates of the first one are 1919 to 1920, and the second one 1947 to 1957. But today we're only going to be talking about the first Red Scare because that's the one that we talked about in class. So, okay, so the first Red Scare was mostly about workers, mainly socialists, and their revolution, and political radicalism. So here we have the Bolshevik Revolution. The first came after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and World War I as national social and political tensions were aggravated. News was spread very exaggeratively that the Bolshevik Revolution would change the American church, home, marriage, civility, and the entire American way of life. So this sort of started to make the Americans suspicious of foreigners. And America sort of started to get xenophobia, which is the fear of foreigners. And anarchism was perceived as the answer to poverty. And anarchism means that the desire to not be ruled by any government. The industrial workers of the world, also known as the IWW, they backed several labor strikes in 1916 and 1917 that were thought to be radical threats to American society, inspired by foreigners, and this is only from the press's point of view because they already had a fear of foreigners. The press misinterpreted legitimate labor strikes as crimes against society, conspiracies against the government, and plots to establish communism. So what really set them off?
So funny.
Oh, I see what you did there. It's not funny.
Okay. April 1919, authorities found a plot that involved the mailing of 36 bombs to members of the American political and economic establishment. These people include J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Alexander Mitchell Palmer, and some other immigration officials. On the 2nd of June 1919, 8 bombs simultaneously exploded in 8 cities. One target was the house of General Palmer, this guy. His house was in Washington, D.C., and it was bombed by an Italian-American radical. Because of this, the federal government consistently targeted alien radicals and deported them, even if they weren't found guilty. They also made little effort to distinguish true threats from non-threats. So they didn't really make a lot of effort to try and find out if these people were really harming the American nation. So thousands of resident aliens were illegally arrested and deported as they were suspected of being communists, even though if they weren't. They were afraid that communist agents were planning to overthrow the American government. A. Mitchell Palmer claimed that communist agents from Russia were planning to overthrow the American government. So on the 7th of November 1919, on the second anniversary of the Russian Revolution, over 10,000 suspected communists and anarchists were arrested. And they were only suspected, they weren't actually found guilty. There was not even any evidence of a proposed revolution by these people, but large numbers of these suspects were held without trial for a long time. and some were deported back to Russia. Okay, never mind, that was actually the right one. So can you go back one, thanks. In 1920, 6,000 were arrested and held without trial. Raids took place in several cities by campaigns set by Palmer, and they are now currently known as the Palmer Raids, in which they captured lead suspects, mostly members of the international, the IWW. Palmer announced that the communist revolution was likely to take place on the 1st of May, and this caused mass panic to take place in America from a fear of something that wasn't even true.
Very nice. Very nice.